It was a presidential punt that could hardly be described as a surprise. Donald Trump, the U.S. president, declining last Friday to certify Iranian compliance of a 2-year-old international agreement meant to curb Tehran's nuclear development.
Today I am announcing our strategy, along with several major steps we are taking to confront the Iranian regime's hostile actions and to ensure that Iran never, and I mean never, acquires a nuclear weapon.
After hearing Trump's threat, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani said Tehran will remain committed to the deal as long as it serves the national interest, but will not renegotiate the terms.
When Trump was making a decision on the Iran nuclear deal, he said, "I want to add a footnote to the deal with the help of Congress." He does not know that no additional articles, footnotes, or a line can be added to the deal.
Trump had certified the deal twice before, begrudgingly. As a candidate last year, the self-proclaimed deal expert called it the worst deal ever. However, leading opposition lawmakers in Washington slammed the announcement as a grave mistake.
Threatening this agreement does not isolate Iran. It isolates America.
Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the Iran nuclear deal, was struck back in July 2015 by Iran and other world powers, including the U.S. and China. It was the culmination of a decade of talks aimed at reining in Iran's nuclear program and was welcomed as a historic move by its signatories. The certification, which Trump declined, is not part of the internationally backed Iran deal, but rather a domestic fail-safe mechanism where the U.S. Congress requires a presidential sign-off every 90 days. Congress now has 60 days to make a decision.
So why is Mr. Trump determined to scuttle the Iran deal, and what's next? Let's get some answers from our panelists. Very strong panel joining us from Beijing studio, Teng Jianqun, Director of the Center for Arms Control with the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome. Joining us in Washington, D.C., we invited Jonah Blank, a senior political scientist at RAND Cooperation in the U.S. In Tehran, Iran, we have Professor Mohammad Marandi, Professor and Dean of World Faculty Studies at the University of Tehran. Welcome, sir. And joining us in Berlin, last but not least, Josef Janning, Senior Fellow at the European Council for Foreign Relations. What a pleasure to have you back, Mr. Janning, on our program again. A big welcome to you as well. Very strong panel. Let's cut the crap and get to the deal. So, Mr. Blank, is there any way that the Congress, which is divided right now on the Iran issue, gonna likely to come up with any solution?
I think it's unlikely, very unlikely, that Congress will pass any sort of law that will try to scuttle the deal. What is possible is that Congress may pass a law to give Mr. Trump a face-saving way of declaring victory. Other than that, I don't see any chance of Congress actually withdrawing the U.S. from this arrangement.
At this point, U.S. President Donald Trump already noted that congressional leaders were already drafting amendments to the Iran nuclear deal. The U.S. Congress may still pass the buck on the agreement. They may also amend it to include ballistic missile ban on Iran. However, any such changes will need 60 votes in the U.S. Senate to pass, and Democrats, of course, at this point, highly unlikely to give them any backing. And once this deal is done, it's likely to be unilateral only, and therefore, in a multilateral issue, Mr. Janning, coming from Germany, do you think that will be accepted by the allies of the United States?
Well, the allies are not inclined in any way to renegotiate this deal because they know that the Iranians don't want it. It has been difficult enough to get that group together with China, with Russia, in the United States. So they will much rather want to stick to the agreement because they see it as the only way to take advantage of the promise that is in that agreement. If there is something that could be done, it might be to conduct separate negotiations on a missile test ban or a missile disarmament agreement with Iran. But in the first place, that would mean to fully honor the existing agreement in order to have the trust on all sides that such an agreement would actually make sense.
Right. China was a party, too, when the deal was done. years ago. So, Mr. Teng, is China going to agree with any kind of change? Originally, according to media reports, China and Russia said there's nothing to be talked about when Washington approached China for any change of the deal.
First, I should say the Iranian nuclear deal actually should be a very important deal, by the international community to solve a nuclear problem by negotiation, by dialogue, and this is actually a very important milestone for the international process in non-proliferation. And China has played a very important role. I met several times the diplomats who participated in the negotiation, and each time when all the delegations, some delegations prefer to leave the table, and China played a very important role to ask all the delegations sit down and to continue the dialogue. So I think the Chinese position is very clear. This is almost a perfect deal among the parties concerned. So I don't think Chinese government will give any change to the deal at this moment.
Okay, it is a done deal, as you said. Not likely to change from the other parties of the deal. But what about for Iran? Professor Marandi, some say with the U.S. withdrawing from this deal, at least in a different version, actually this deal is dead. Do you agree?
Well, if the deal becomes a useless piece of paper, and if what the Americans think, if the American government thinks that they can force Iran to abide by its commitments, yet the United States simply just add sanction after sanction until the Iranians don't benefit from the agreement, then they're mistaken. The Iranians will definitely leave the deal. So it's really up to the United States. I don't think that there's a chance in the world that the Iranians will accept any change to the deal, and there's not a chance in the world that the Iranians will negotiate over their missile defense capability. The only reason why the United States in the past few years does not seriously think about attacking the country is because Iran has a capable defense. And also, the very fact that Trump has so discredited himself and the U.S. government by questioning a deal that the United States has committed itself to, and that 6 countries and Iran have all negotiated for years on, I think shows that the United States is simply not a country that you can negotiate with, at least until Trump is president. So on the one hand, the current deal is now open to question whether it's going to last, but more importantly, regardless of the fact that Iran won't negotiate missile technology or its defense capability, that is what keeps it safe, but why in the world would Iran ever want to negotiate with the United States again? Indeed, why would anyone want to negotiate with the United States in future when no one knows if the United States will abide by its own commitments in the future?
All right.
Why should, for example, China or North Korea or Europeans sign on to something with Americans where 6 months down the road the Americans may say, no, we don't want that?
All right, here's the thing, Mr. Janning. If the Americans walk away, as Mr. Trump has this, the Trump way or the highway, meaning my way or I'll leave it, right? What are the Europeans going to do? I mean, Iran, according to Professor Marandi, is also suggesting, if the United States do not back this deal, the deal possibly will be dead, and therefore we're not in the deal. So it seems that the Europeans, together with the Chinese, are the only one in the deal, which are not a stakeholder.
Yeah, that's indeed the situation. You see, what the costs of the Trump policy is when you listen to our Iranian colleague, because it basically hands an easy argument to him. From a European perspective, there is interest to keep the stakes of Iran in that deal. And that only works if, A, the Iranians trust their partners, which the Europeans are very eager to uphold, and secondly, if there is actually time for Iran to discover that the benefits of a non-sanctioned environment, the benefits of a normalizing relationship with the international community basically outweigh the advantages that you could get through nuclear technology or nuclear arms. And that requires some time, and that is what the Europeans would very much like to ensure.
Well, Mr. Blank, I've been seeing your gestures and also reactions listening to the other guests. What do you think will be the next step for the United States, given the fact there is a big divide between the administration, parties like the White House and the State Department, given the fact that there is now a bigger divide between the allies, United States and the European ones, and also given the fact there is a big divide between the United States and any of the other parties in this deal, including Iran, China, Russia, the Europeans. What can be the next step for the United States?
Well, just as all of the panelists here are saying essentially the same thing, that is that it would be a very bad step for the United States to try to renegotiate this deal, and that the United States would fail if it tried to do that. That is the consensus within Washington as well. About the only person who does not hold that view is the President himself. The Secretary of Defense, Secretary Mattis, testified to exactly this point on October 2nd. The highest-ranking U.S. military official in uniform, General Dunford, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said the same thing as well. That's where Congress is, too. So I think it's very unlikely that the U.S. will actually try to withdraw from this. The problem is that the President wants some sort of a face-saver, and that might come from Congress, but I think it's very unlikely for it to be anything other than a non-substantive resolution, which might enable the President to believe that he has achieved some sort of renegotiation.
That could be one possibility, but when you think about it, is it only face-saver? Mr. Teng from China, for example, in the U.S. Congress, we understand the Republicans has never been fans of Iran, and there are some who are giving applause to President Trump at this point in his party. Meanwhile, there is this thought about whether the United States want to give Iran this opportunity to continue to grow as a regional power, given what is happening in that part of the world, in the Middle East. What do you think? Is this only a face-saver, or is there something more than that?
Yeah, right. I think this is not only a technical issue. This is not a nuclear issue. Actually, this is the geopolitical competition between Iran and the United States. Actually, according to the tradition of the Republicans in the United States, they do not like the multilateral approach to find a solution to the dispute like nuclear differences. I think another aspect is Iran. Actually, in recent 20 years, Iran has become stronger and stronger in the Middle East, and I'm sure President Donald Trump and the Republican have certainly realized that this is a real challenge for the Middle East policy of the United States. So they would like to make an excuse by the nuclear or missile or even the support of terrorism by Iran to give some sanctions, give further sanctions. According to the deal, all the parties should not, impose new sanctions, and the old sanctions should be, step by step lifted according to the compliance of the deal by Iran.
That's right. What you meant is that with the United States, at least Congress coming up with a different version, it is already violating the earlier done deal. But let me come back to you, Mr. Blank, for you to respond to the Chinese panelists, the deal.
The Chinese critique of the deal, of the administration's response to it, if I understand it, is basically in line with the European critique, the Iranian critique, and the critique of many, I would say most, within Washington right here. First, that the U.S. cannot renegotiate this deal. It is a deal with 6 parties and Iran. Second, that it would be foolish for the U.S. to withdraw. Third, that the U.S. has no basis for claiming that Iran has violated the deal, all of which I think are true. However, the administration's response is different. It claims that the deal does not block Iran from acquiring ballistic missiles and from engaging in terrorism. things that this deal was never intended to address.
Right.
So the parties are really talking right past each other.
All right. Professor Marandi, do you think if this deal is not fully implemented as it was, and if Iran is going to hold the attitude, as you mentioned earlier, is geopolitical situation in your region going to be going a very different direction? Your assessment, very briefly, sir.
Well, a couple of things are important. When Trump was the candidate, he basically said that Obama was responsible for ISIS. And he also acknowledged that Iran was, alongside the Russians, were fighting ISIS. And he also blamed the Saudis for the extremism in this region. But now, only a year later, we see he's basically reversed things altogether. So the whole narrative that comes out of Washington I find quite extraordinary. The Iranian position right now in the region is largely as a result of U.S. policy. The United States allowed its ally Saudi Arabia to invade Yemen. The Yemenis turned to Iran. The United States government, Trump, supported the Saudis in the standoff with Qatar. The Qataris turned to Iran. The United States played with the Kurds against the Turkish government. The Turkish government turned to Iran. These are, no one can blame Iran when countries in the region see a flawed U.S. policy, when the United States supports extremism in Syria through its allies or itself, as we see from the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, then Iran has reason to believe that the United States is the one, along with its allies, causing the problems. And I also should add this, that right now Iran is not only defending the sovereignty of Iraq and Syria, but also even with regards to the JCPOA, many in Iran were opposed to it. The JCPOA has many critics. Many think it's a deeply flawed deal. But at the end of the day, opponents and supporters and those in between, they saw that when the Iranians made the decision to abide by this agreement, when they had to sign the agreement, everyone agreed that once we've made a commitment, we have to abide by it. So even those who are now saying to the president, I told you so, none of them, as far as I know, have said a single word about Iran violating the agreement. So at the end of the day, the ball is really in Trump's court. Either he wants the agreement or he doesn't. And one thing that the Europeans can do is they can pass laws and regulations to defend their businesses and their businessmen and women. That could play a very important role in helping to preserve the deal.
Since you talk about the Europeans, Mr. Janning, there was a well-known quote in the media reports about a telephone conversation between Trump and also the French president, talking about whether the French has had big deals with Renault, which of course have a deal with Iran. But having said that, though, what is likely to be the European way of dealing with this? To be in the back chamber, persuading those on the Capitol Hill to go back to the original deal, or the Europeans will remain silent no matter where the deal or no deal is going? Mr. Janning.
Well, Chen-Wei, the Europeans will try to hedge this agreement in several ways. First of all, they will continuously work with the Iranians to reinforce their decision to commit and abide by the agreement. Secondly, they will try to keep the international community on board, because the Europeans believe actually that this agreement is sort of an indicator of where the world is going in terms of non-proliferation. And thirdly, of course, they will use all of their contacts and means available to work the floors in Washington. That may not have the effect in the White House, but I think it will certainly be heard among the experts, among the policy community, and among the legislators.
You raised an interesting point, which I would like to go back to Mr. Blank from the United States. Exactly what is happening with so-called our world order, and also is the United States going to still be part of it, in which it helped to establish and build, and now when it cannot have 100% say about everything at any time, will it just walk away?
This is a very good question, and it brings up the point that Professor Marandi raised earlier about the question of U.S. credibility. Is the word of the United States good? And this matters in North Korea. It matters with any nation that wants to do business with the U.S. This is why Mr. Trump's approach really does not have a whole lot of support in Congress or really throughout the policymaking arena. I think it's important to look at how Mr. Trump views a deal in order to understand this. He tends to view a deal, at least in my interpretation, as a display of dominance, as something that is zero-sum, that is, if I win, you must lose, and something open to perpetual renegotiation. That's not how diplomacy works, and that is why I feel that the U.S. will revert to the norm and will not be drawn down this very dangerous path.
All right. Talking about the dangerous path, Mr. Teng, you are a scholar researching about the Korean nuclear issue. And does this issue that we are talking about today between Iran and the United States, this Iran deal, ring a bell to you?
Yeah, I think this is actually a very controversial, debate at this moment about Iranian nuclear issue. If we look at Donald Trump's policy toward Iran, actually, as we discussed just now, it's not a nuclear issue. Actually, Donald Trump would like to maintain in the deal and will continue the sanctions against Iran. So this is actually a very complicated situation for Iranian nuclear deal. And I'm sure the countries concerned, including China and some European countries, will continue the implementation of the deal. And I'm sure.
But the question is, will China still try to help the United States and the DPRK to come up with a deal?
That might be a side effect on the international non-proliferation effort at this moment. I'm sure if U.S. really withdraws from the deal, that might set a very bad example to the other issues, especially DPRK nuclear issues. So we should learn lessons from history.
Mr. Blank, final question for you, very briefly. Who have a say, eventually, help me to understand this, about this deal or no deal with Iran, and also who is going to have an upper hand about what kind of deal, whether negotiation or not, with North Korea. We really need to understand from all different parts of the world about what exactly is going on there. We cannot just let it go there and also be based under the sun as if there's nothing happening.
Yes. Well, Mr. Trump will have the ultimate say in U.S. policy. However, the question is, will he go against his top advisors, his Secretary of Defense, his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of the people who have the military expertise, who are saying quite openly that a war with Iran, a war with North Korea, neither of these is remotely in the U.S. interest. It's the view of many in Washington that ultimately he will not go against this advice.
We'll see what's going to happen, but thank you so much for the four of you for your insights and direct answers. Jonah Blank, Mohammad Marandi, Josef Janning, once again, great to see you, sir, and Teng Jianqun. Thank you so much, the four of you gentlemen, for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.